Hello everyone, I'm Matt from the DeLINEATE toolbox, here to give you a quick tutorial that's kind of twofold. One is to show you how to install the toolbox on a virtual machine in case you just want to play around with it a little bit and don't want to commit to putting it on a full computer. And the other is to show you how to set it up with the new way that they distribute Keras, which is as a part of TensorFlow, which is kind of a new thing at the time of this recording. So the first thing you're going to need to do, if you haven't done this already, is to get an operating system for your virtual machine. I'm just going to use Ubuntu. You can use whatever you want, but this tutorial works with Ubuntu. Download Ubuntu Desktop, and that should start downloading. Now, what I'm actually going to do, I've actually already downloaded this, and the download is looking kind of slow. So I'm going to actually, you would actually download this, but I'm actually just going to cancel it and use the one, do this like Julia Child's style, where I've already secretly baked the muffins or whatever, and I already know where they are. So just pretend we downloaded that, and now we have an operating system disk image to install on our virtual machine. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch VirtualBox, which is it's free. I use that for virtual machines. Gonna start a new virtual machine, and let's call this DeLINEATE VM demo or something like that. It's already figured out somehow that it's Linux, but if not, we can select that. I don't think it really matters. I think it just changes the icons that you see. I'm going to select that it's Ubuntu 64-bit. Going to give it some memory, 4096 megabytes. I mean, you could pick whatever there. Do want to make sure we create a big enough virtual hard disk. So if you have a lot of data, you're going to want to make it bigger. But I'm on a little MacBook Air, so I'm going to make mine relatively small because this only needs to be big enough for the demo. 20 gigs should be enough. I tried this the first time. The default of 10 gigs was not enough. I had to do it again, but 20 should be fine. And I'm going to go ahead and start the machine. I'll go back and explain this a little bit more. Oh, sorry. I've got a dual monitor set up here, and stuff is coming up on the wrong monitor. So here we go. So we're going to select a virtual optical disk to boot the system from. So I'm just going to add one to the list, and let's go to my home folder here and pick that. That's the file that I had already downloaded that we pretended to download at the beginning. Okay, and it's going to start. I'm going to actually make this slightly bigger, even bigger still. Yeah, I'll go back through and go into a little more detail, but since we're installing an OS, that'll take a few minutes, and so we can talk about some of the concepts once that's going. So yeah, what we're going to do is, if you haven't used a virtual machine before, it's pretty straightforward. It's, essentially a way to, it's not exactly emulation, but we can say it's like emulating another computer inside your computer, right? And we're using VirtualBox, which is, at the time of recording this, still a completely free way to do VMs. You can also use VMware, or I think you can use Parallels to run Linux too, but I have VMware, but I mostly use VirtualBox because it's free and it's pretty easy to set up. So yeah, we're going to set up a virtual computer to install our Linux operating system in. And again, you wouldn't have to do this in a VM, but if you're just playing around with the toolbox and you don't want to mess up your own computer's Python installation, I find a VM is a pretty good way to kind of test some things out and keep it kind of siloed or sandboxed in one place. So any minute now, it should be booting into the OS installer for Ubuntu. Here we go. So yeah, those, I'm not here to explain the entire principles of VMs or anything like that. Oh, how nice. So, that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're doing here, but, the initial setup, if I kind of zipped through it, but it wasn't too bad. Just pick how much virtual RAM you want the machine to have, how much virtual hard disk space. We're going to say we're going to install Ubuntu. And, obviously, if you're doing heavy-duty data analysis, you'd probably want to select more than what I selected. But, then again, if you're doing heavy-duty data analysis, you probably don't want to do it inside a virtual machine. All right, I'm just going to have it install everything, even though that takes a little bit longer, but easier to just do that, I feel like, than try to pick and choose software packages. I have been through this Ubuntu installer 7 zillion times in my life, so I'm very familiar with it. But you know, there's not too much to actually pick here. There would be more if this were a real piece of hardware that I really cared about getting exactly right. But for the sake of this demo, you know, just some basic options should be fine. Yeah, so just to recap while we're waiting on this, we've downloaded the operating system image. You know, again, I'm using Ubuntu, or Ubuntu if you prefer. You know, you could, like I said, you could just run this on your Mac. You could run it on your Windows machine. You could run it on a different flavor of Linux. You could do whatever. But if we're doing a virtual machine, I find Linux pretty easy to deal with. And actually, I tend to find that the best for running kind of scientific computing in general. Okay, yeah, erase and install Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is perfectly good. I know everyone's got their preference, but it's an easy one to install. These days it's pretty seamless to install it. All right. We're erasing our hard disk, but not the real Mac hard disk, just the virtual hard disk inside the virtual Linux machine, so we're all good there. Yeah, so if you're using a different kind of Linux, Chicago time zone's fine and accurate. Yeah, if you're running another version of Linux, most of this will probably be about the same, especially if it's Debian based. I think it's Debian or Debian, whatever it is. All right, let's see. We'll just call this Matt. I'm going to choose a very weak, bad password because this is just a virtual machine that's going to have a lifespan of about 20 minutes. So I normally would not have a simple one-character password as my password, but that'll make it easy to authenticate and everything. So now we have a couple of minutes to kill. I may fast forward this part if I run out of stuff to say. But yeah, so we're going to set up this virtual Ubuntu machine. And yeah, we're going to just put everything we need onto it. Should only take a few minutes. And you'll kind of see how that all works. But yeah, anyway, so yeah, most of the instructions we have here should work equally well for any kind of Debian-based, which Ubuntu is one of the Debian-based Linux distributions. Roughly speaking, these instructions should translate fairly well to other operating systems. It's just some of the stuff to get VMs working and stuff is going to be specific to working within a VM in general. And I'm just looking at my little cheat sheet here to see. Yeah, pretty much everything else should be OS independent, actually. So it's really the virtual machine stuff that's kind of specific to my particular case of running this stuff in Ubuntu. The actual stuff that deals with Python and TensorFlow and Keras and the DeLINEATE toolbox, that should all be pretty much the same for any OS. All right, so pretty much we just have to sit here and watch this thing install. I'm probably going to fast forward this and just let you skip right to the end so you don't have to sit here and wait with me. Okay, we're getting to the end here. Presumably I just fast forwarded through that and you didn't have to sit through all of it with me. Okay, this looks good. Installation's complete, restart the computer, that's fine. Again, that's just the virtual machine, not the actual computer that I'm running on. So we'll do that. Hopefully hopefully I can get rid of some of the noise. This is really making the fans spin up on my laptop here, so hopefully that won't come across too much in the audio recording. Okay, so we're just rebooting our virtual Ubuntu machine, and we're going to do a little bit more waiting here in a second because I'm going to let it install some software updates, just on the off chance that that makes a difference. It probably doesn't on a virtual machine, but it's still something I would do if I were setting up a real machine, so I'm willing to spend a couple of extra minutes doing it on my virtual machine also, just in case there's anything buggy or crashy or whatever. Two of the least popular dwarfs there, buggy and crashy. So yeah, we're going to let it finish booting up. Got a giant, I have my Mac pointer set to be a little bit larger than normal, but that makes it truly gigantic apparently when going into the virtual machine. Not sure exactly why that happens. All right, so we are going to skip most of the setup stuff for a new operating system. Don't send them system info because this system is going to last for all of like 10 minutes. Don't turn on location. I'm not going to install any bonus software. And we'll probably in a second get a pop-up about software updates. At least we have every time I've done this so far. So while we're doing that, I'll just kind of remove some of this junk from my favorites. Don't really need any of that. Not my favorites. Oh, that's interesting. It's not doing the little software update thing. Probably will in a second when I try to do anything. And I'm just going to go ahead and search for the terminal here, my applications list, because we're going to want to do a lot of this on the command line. And I'm going to go ahead and add that to my favorites, so it's in the little dock here. Okay, that's interesting. So every time I've done this in my dry runs, I've got an immediate pop-up from the OS asking about software updates. And now I'm not, so that's fine. I'm just not going to do them then. We'll see what happens. That'll save a couple minutes anyway. All right, so yeah, so this is actually something I'm just doing for the purposes, well, most of this is for the benefit of the virtual machine thing. Because right now, we're still running at a super low resolution and stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a sudo apt-get install, and I'm going to install GCC. Oh, there we go. Of course. Of course. All right, I'm just going to go ahead and tell it to install now. So just ignore this. I'm not going to do this stuff in the terminal because the updater is going to make me restart. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to restart a couple times here. So while this is updating, I'll say what I was going to do, which is, right now we're running in this virtual machine inside VirtualBox. And until we install some extra software on the, the imaginary Ubuntu system, the functionality is pretty basic. If we want to do things like resize the virtual screen and stuff, we need to install essentially some like drivers that run on the Ubuntu operating system that kind of, essentially let the system know sort of that it's a virtual machine. Not exactly, but, basically let the virtual machine communicate with the actual Macintosh that I am running on. So in order to install those drivers, we have to install some other packages and stuff. So it's a kind of a multi-step process just to kind of get a Linux virtual machine up and running, and kind of, have it do basic things like have a decent sized monitor resolution and so on. But it's nothing super advanced or anything like that. So this should just take a minute or two for this to run the software updates. Again, I don't know that any of this is strictly necessary, but some of the stuff it's updating is stuff like I've seen Python come up here and so on, and we are definitely using Python. Yeah, so there's like Python stuff. So it is updating Python and such. So probably a good idea to let the, let the operating system updater run. So that'll just take another minute or two usually. Might fast forward this too, so you don't have to sit through all of this with me. But yeah, what we're going to do, once this finishes is we'll reboot the machine to kind of, let these updates settle in, and then we'll install a couple of packages that we're going to need for what VirtualBox calls, what does it call it? Guest editions, which is basically the software that runs on what they call the guest operating system, the Ubuntu operating system, that let it better interface with the, the VirtualBox software. And as we install those packages, I'm going to go ahead and install a couple of other packages that we're going to use for our stuff, for the DeLINEATE toolbox. So you'll see me do this in a second, but for the purposes of the guest editions, we're going to need to install GCC, which is the C compiler, make, which is needed to install stuff, or build and install software as well, along with the C compiler, and apparently it needs Perl also, the programming language. So we're going to install those, and then for the toolbox, we're going to install Git, like GitHub, or need to install Git so that we can download a copy of the toolbox software and a Python tool for virtual environments, because I think it's a good idea to run inside a virtual environment. So we're going to just install all those in one fell swoop as soon as this software updater finishes. Which again should be any time now. It shouldn't take all that long, but it's not super fast. All right, so I'm probably going to fast forward you so you don't have to see all this. Okay, I think we're about ready to finish the updater here. So in a second, it's going to ask me if I want to reboot the computer, and I'm going to say yes. All right, here we go. Restart now. And I might have been able to combine that with the other stuff I was going to install, but the reboot itself takes almost no time, so I may as well just do it. It's just the installation that takes kind of a long time. Okay, so we have, again, we haven't really done much yet except for install an OS on the virtual machine and update it essentially. So now we're going to really get into the stuff that is semi-relevant for the toolbox as soon as we do a little bit of this VM specific stuff. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a sudo apt. Let's try that again. Apt get install. And I'm going to get gcc make perl get and python 3 vm. I think those are all the packages I need. Put in my very basic password. Say yes to this. And again, those first three packages, gcc make and perl, those are going to be needed for the guest editions just to make it the virtual machine run a little bit better. And then Git is going to be used to obtain a version of the toolbox. And then that Python 3 virtual environment thing is so that we can set up the toolbox inside a virtual environment, which is not strictly necessary for what we're doing here, but I think a good thing to do in general. So this actually shouldn't take all that long to install these packages, just another minute or two. But then and that's not going to require a restart, but then when I run the guest editions, that will require a restart. So I'm going to put in the guest editions CD image. It's going to launch a virtual CD. We're going to say run the software on it. It needs my admin password again, my 1-character password. Again, this isn't meant to be a tutorial on just Linux in general or anything. Hopefully, if you're doing this kind of stuff, you probably already know things like what sudo or sudo is, because when I did the command to install those extra libraries, it was sudo apt get install blah blah blah, which is just a way of saying like install these packages using the package manager tool, which is called apt, and sudo or sudo makes you do it as the super user. In other words, it gives administrative privileges. So sorry if I'm not explaining every little bit of how Linux works, but presumably most of the people that are going to watch this in the first place have at least passing familiarity with the Unix or Linux command line. And no shame if you don't, but that's kind of a separate computer usage issue that is separate from the toolbox per se. All right, so eject the virtual CD, and what that message said in the command line was that we did need to restart in order for it to take effect. So we're going to do that. And all that's really going to gain us, again, it's not really that necessary, I guess, but it's going to gain us the ability to resize our desktop, which is helpful if we want a slightly bigger and more easy to navigate desktop. If we were using this more permanently, you'd want to do that for, things like being able to copy and paste between the Mac and the Linux machine and so on. Okay, so let's just about log this in. So now we've got really our virtual machine all set up, and the rest of this is just all about getting the DeLINEATE toolbox and using it, which actually, after all that, doesn't take all that long. So first I'm going to just size up the virtual machine a little bit. Oh, that's probably, let's not scale it so big though, so you can kind of make this whatever size you want. That should be plenty big for what we're doing here. I could size it all the way up to the 1080p, but it's kind of nice to see it on the Mac screen like this, I think. All right, so let's launch a web browser here. Actually, no, we don't have to do this part quite yet. Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. Let's actually just launch a terminal first. I got a little excited to get the toolbox, but we don't have to do that quite yet. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just going to change onto my desktop. You can put this wherever, but I'm just going to put these files on my desktop. And I'm going to do a Python 3 -m and we'll call it like, you know, if you were doing this for real with real data, it would be the name of some project or whatever. So what we're doing here is we're creating a virtual, if you haven't done this before, we're creating a virtual Python environment, which basically is like a separate install of Python, sort of, more or less. That basically, like, what we can do is we can install Python packages and things and not mess up the packages and the tools that are installed for the system Python. And I think that's a useful way to do this stuff. Somewhere that should have created a directory called my project. Let's see, yeah. And essentially, what I think what I would recommend for people actually using the toolbox for analyses is to for every project maybe make a new virtual environment. Because toolbox is getting updated all the time. Python and Keras and TensorFlow and such are all getting updates all the time, and I just found it easier to, like, rather than try to like keep all these packages in balance, to just start a new virtual environment for every project. Just so, like, if you want to have the latest, software for a new project, but still want to be able to go back and run an old project, you don't have to do too much juggling. So anyway, if we want to like start up our virtual environment, we run source bin/activate, which you can see what this does is it puts that little parentheses out there, which means now we are, like, anything we do with Python now is doing it within this my project virtual environment. And again, I know this isn't the greatest explanation of what those are. We're now running a virtual environment inside a virtual box. That's all the levels of virtual that we're going to get, I think, today. But you can Google and learn about Python virtual environments. That's just a built-in feature of Python. Okay, so what I'm going to do next now, so this is the thing about, like I said, there's two things that we're doing in this tutorial. One is just showing you how a virtual machine situation works. The other is showing you how to install or how to work with the toolbox when you're using Keras that comes within TensorFlow. So while this is installing, I'll kind of define those things. So, or say a little bit about the history. So TensorFlow is kind of a relatively low-level toolbox, not super low level, but somewhat low level toolbox for doing deep learning stuff. And historically, Keras has been a somewhat higher level toolbox that I believe was originally developed separately from TensorFlow and all that. And Keras kind of could use TensorFlow as a backend, but it could also use other deep learning toolboxes like Theano as a backend. And basically what happened is, again, I don't know the internal politics of this too well, but however it shook out, the Keras development has been kind of sucked into the TensorFlow development. And so now, whereas previously you would kind of install TensorFlow and then run Keras on top of that, now Keras is packaged along with TensorFlow as kind of a part of TensorFlow. And that's all well and good. It's pretty much the same as it always was, with the exception that they're dropping Theano support, basically, as far as I know. Although you can still kind of use an old version of Keras with Theano just fine. But anyway, it does kind of change the paths and stuff like that a little bit. So in order to not break the toolbox, you have to jump through a couple little hoops here. By the way, we're getting some warnings and errors here. It doesn't appear in my tests to have affected anything. I didn't dive too deeply into what exactly is not compiling correctly or whatever, but it looks like it's, if I'm reading that right, it's more of a, just graphical stuff or whatever, nothing that's going to matter for what we're doing. So anyway, Watch out for those warnings, but who knows, that's probably a temporary issue anyway. So anyway, yeah, so nowadays Keras is distributed as part of TensorFlow. And what we can see now is if we run Python, just like run a Python interpreter, we can now import TensorFlow, and we could use TensorFlow functions and so on if we wanted to. Now, if we wanted to import Keras, which is traditionally how you import a Keras, we get the error that says the module named Keras. Now we could say, I believe this works. I haven't tried this in a while. I think this works. Yeah, so you could import it that way, but that's not how the toolbox is used to importing Keras, and it kind of screws some stuff up. So what we're actually going to want to do is you can still install standalone Keras, at least at the time of my recording this. And this, it basically is just like a reference to the TensorFlow Keras, but if you install Keras separately after you install TensorFlow, it sets the paths up correctly so that you can kind of import Keras directly, which is what the toolbox is typically expecting. So maybe in the future we'll get it all reconfigured to find the Keras that's buried within TensorFlow. But that's a relatively recent change and we haven't adapted to that yet. So in the meantime, you just kind of install separate Keras. Now if you run Python, you can just do import Keras, and that works just fine. And it's still set up to use TensorFlow and everything. It's just, you can also import Keras directly. So that's all well and good. We've now got, an installation that can run TensorFlow stuff and use Keras. Now, it's not using the GPU, so it's not going to go very fast because this Mac doesn't even have an NVIDIA GPU, and even if it did, it wouldn't be very usable inside a virtual machine. But, for purposes of playing around with the toolbox, that's fine. So now we're going to go to that Firefox window that I opened prematurely earlier, and we're just going to download a copy of the DeLINEATE toolbox. And I'm going to download, by the time you actually see this, the new version of the toolbox is probably going to be released, but it's not yet. So what I'm going to do, just to make sure we have the latest possible stuff, I'm going to download the repository version. You could, once this is released, you could download the distributed version, which is going to be 0.04b. But I'm just going to do it this way. This is why we had to install Git earlier, because we're going to clone using Git. So let's copy that. And last time I did this, it didn't copy very well the first time. So let's just make sure that copied before I close the window. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to, in this My Project folder, I'm just going to go ahead and clone a copy of the Git repo. And again, if you're not used to using Git, a full explanation is probably beyond the scope of this video, because that's another kind of generic programming and, software development kind of thing. But, it's essentially a source code management platform. And we're just like downloading a copy of the toolbox code essentially. And again, like I said, by the time this comes out, you could just go to the website and click on the release version and get an up-to-date version. But we are a couple of days from putting that out as it stands right now. So I'm just getting the in development version. All right. So if we look at what we've got here now in our little project folder, most of this stuff was installed as part of the setting up the virtual environment, but now we have a folder called DeLINEATE in here. And so what I'm going to do is just going to go into the DeLINEATE folder and see what we've got there. We've got all the normal files that come as part of the toolbox. So let's see if we've got it all set up right. And if we do, then on Python delineate.py, and we'll just run one of our sample job files. Let's see what my options are. Let's just run that 64x4 MLP. Two of these are set up for, we're not going to set up CyclePy in this demonstration because that's not really what we're about. So these are both CyclePy job files, but we can run either this or this in Keras. So we'll just run the first one there. And if everything's working okay, which it looks like it is, yeah, we're getting our Keras running. So again, if you're new to Keras and stuff, there's other tutorials, including some from us, about what this stuff actually means. But the long and the short of it is, it looks like our toolbox is now set up, and we have the Keras-within-TensorFlow working correctly, and it's all running inside this virtual Ubuntu machine running on my little MacBook Air here. So everything is pretty hunky-dory. So I think that's pretty much it. We can see that it's actually going at a pretty good clip as these things go. I mean, despite the fact that it would run many times faster on a GPU. But, you know, we're getting pretty good accuracy here. I don't even remember exactly which data set we're classifying here, but I think it's something with 33% chance. So, you know, 60%-ish accuracy is not too shabby for the validation. So yeah, it's training along just fine. And so that's basically it. So hopefully this gives you what you need to play around with the toolbox in a virtual machine if you ever want to do that, and explains, hopefully that kind of makes sense how Keras is baked into TensorFlow and all that jazz. You know, and like I said, maybe in future versions you won't have to jump through those hoops quite as much, but it's really not much of a hoop. It's just one additional install of the Keras toolbox, you know, on top of installing TensorFlow. So all things considered, that's a pretty easy setup ritual. Now again, if you're running on a real machine with a real GPU and stuff, the main headache you're going to have to deal with is all the drivers and all that jazz. And we do have a video about that that's a little outdated now, but the basic principles are still the same. So you can check that out in our documentation section elsewhere. And as always, you know, feel free to get in touch with us. Information's on our contact page. Give us a shout if you have any questions or anything. So I think that, well, that has to be it, apparently, because my screen just cut off. Okay, I think that's it. The screen went to sleep for some reason. Hopefully that didn't kill the video, but yeah. All right, I think we're done here. So thanks again for watching. Hopefully that made some sense to you, and happy toolboxing. Bye.